Virginia Woolf. So Virginia Woolf belonged to the Bloomsbury Group, which was a collective of writers, artists, and intellectuals that included figures like E.M. Forster, John Keynes, and Lytton Strachey. Bloomsbury had deep roots in Cambridge, and both the constitution and preoccupation of the group were determined by the friendships and enthusiasms of the male members in their college days. By all accounts, and particularly in the books of Clive Bell and the second of two memoirs of Lord Keynes, we have a full explanation of the overwhelming influence of the philosophy of G.E. Moore on the youthful members of the group. Although we can hardly pause here even to nod at the complexities of this influence, we can see briefly what the heart of G.E. Moore's doctrine, as Bloomsbury saw it, was. That by far, the most valuable things which we know or can imagine are certain states of consciousness, which may be roughly described as the pleasures of human intercourse and the enjoyment of beautiful objects. So the consciousness of the statement is directly related to the intensity with which the group took it up as a manifesto. Nearly all reality in their thought ends in states of mind. And when other considerations, even when a character of Moore's principal Ethica, stood in the way of hypothesizing the state of mind as the absolute value, out it went. They had sufficient reason for supposing that it is only for the sake of these things that anyone can be justified in performing any public or private duty, that they are the raison d'etre of virtue, that it is they that form the rational ultimate end of human action, and the sole criteria of social progress. Of course, the passion with which the group adopted these values reflects the depth of their commitment to all the assumptions of English aestheticism as concentrated in Pager and Wilde. The subjects of Bloomsbury conversation, as Keynes presents them, tally remarkable with many of Mrs. Woolf's basic concerns in epistemology. But if Mrs. Woolf concerned herself with the same basic preoccupation as this group of male friends, she substituted the standard of sensibility for their scientific mensuration, and she projected such questions directly into the flux of consciousness while she presented them as occurring in the course of average lives of the kind of people she knew. The moment of vision in her novel is a flowering of a good state of mind in the consciousness. Jack of Flanders is a mosaic of the states of minds of others, and Mrs. Dalloway is composed of an interrelated series of states of minds, even those of a madman, presented as absolutes in themselves, without condemnation, sentimentality, or excuses. The absence of violent action in her novels, aside from the suicide of Septimus, is obviously a part of the doctrine of the irrelevance of action to good states of mind. Her refusal to accept the pat solution and the 32 chapters of ordinary novel structure is a protest against the kind of reality such structures reflect. The troubled, unresolved, and often painful tone of the scene after scene in her novel comes from regarding unflinchingly all the components of the mind. Many of these states become standardized in her novels. They are the party consciousness, the who am I, where am I state, the riding an omnibus state, the I am a tree state, the it is finished state, and the state of mystical explanation in solitude, in which the emotions become a liquid flood, a sharp point, or a dark wedge. Mrs. Woolf's unwavering honesty and directness of attack are the aesthetic corollary of the scientific rigor of men in the group, and she knows that this is the case. But I recognize my own limitations. Lytton used to say, "Do I instinctively keep my mind from analyzing, which would impair creativeness?" The answer is pretty obviously yes. Mrs. Woolf always had a hearty feeling for original sin and never have shared the faith of the others in the sweet reasonableness of human beings. She was too acutely aware, from her own suffering, of the irrational and insane springs within man. Aside from her husband's statement that she committed suicide in fear of a return of a nervous malady, there is ample evidence in the diary of faintings, excruciating headaches, pains like those of childbirth, and the like, all of which shows that Mrs. Woolf herself was profoundly aware of the precariousness of human reason. Both these aspects of her experience, the value system of G.E. Moore and her own experience with nervous derangement, are the basis of her most popular novel, Mrs. Dalloway. Woolf's writing is characterized by its innovative narrative techniques, such as stream of consciousness, which she was inspired from Joyce, and how it focuses on the interior lives of her characters, majorly through her tunneling technique as well as her interior monologue. The difference between Virginia Woolf and Joyce, however, would be that Joyce uses direct interior monologue, where the thoughts of the characters are presented exactly as they are, whereas Woolf uses the indirect interior monologue, where the thoughts are presented approximately as how the characters would think them. While Joyce brings into the consciousness memories of the past in order to qualify the experience of the present, and thus create a new mental act of apprehension. Over here we see how Joyce would use memories of the past to explain the experiences in the present, something that I refer to as epiphanies in my Joyce video. But Woolf does it a little differently. Woolf introduces memories of the past, and that by and large, they are fully evoked for their own sake, and they disengage the character from the present. They have nothing to do with justifying their present experiences. Again, her books, the most popular being Mrs. Dalloway, they're not a Bildungsroman, unlike Joyce's The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. We also see that Joyce shows us consciousness opening up into the depth of time and an actual act of change and growth, whereas Virginia Woolf shows us consciousness opening up into the depth of time only in intense moments of vision. So no actual action is going on. These are just intense moments of vision. So now you can probably tell how different Virginia Woolf and Joyce are with the way they deal with the stream of consciousness technique. For Virginia Woolf, life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. Life is a luminous halo, a semi-transparent envelope surrounding us from beginning of consciousness to the end. And this is the kind of envelope that she talks about in her essay, The Modern Fiction, where she makes a fair attempt to discuss the main trends of the modern novel. So she mentions workers or writers like H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett, and Galsworthy. And they propounded new ideas, of course they did, but they also followed Victorian tradition when it came to the technique of their novels. And that's something that she did not like. She marked all three of them as materialists, and she thought that these writers, as well as their writing, is stuffed with unimportant things, but they make the trivial into the truth of life, whereas it's not the truth of life, and that's what makes their books so devoid of life, where reality of life is highly missing from their works. All of this is happening because the writer is constrained, right? There's a catalog of types such as plot, comedy, tragedy, treatment of love, etc. that they're given to him, and all he can do is just move a few things around. So there is no spontaneity or no flow of consciousness that is inhibiting the characters of these writers. And that's where she introduces the concept of the stream of consciousness. Here, of course, she talks about Joyce because, as I said, she was highly influenced by him. James Joyce and Joseph Conrad were the innovators when it came to the stream of consciousness technique. There is disconnection and incoherence because life is recorded not as chronological events that are arranged properly, but rather life is recorded as atoms of life, right? That is the stream of consciousness, where the reality is not lying in outer actions, but in the inner workings of the human mind, in the inner perception. So what would the stream of consciousness technique then hold for the reader? Number one, subjectivity. There is no conventional omniscient narrator. Number two, delving into the minds of the characters and emotions. Number three, psychological realism, where we're portraying the lives of the characters along with the complexities and the fragmentary way in which their thoughts occur and then just disappear all of a sudden. Number four, momentary reality, because she was opposed to linear, time-bound storytelling, and therefore you will see that the way she arranges her spatio-temporal infrastructure is very, very different from, let's say, Victorian writers. And number five, abstract representation. Now, she supported the use of symbols, metaphors, and abstract language to convey deeper meanings of life. and they again become a part of the stream of consciousness technique. The narrative is moving from consciousness to consciousness, and therefore we are shifting. Multiple perspectives will be present if this is the case, and therefore we're moving back and forth in time. The idea here then becomes that instead of having divisive sections of times that we conventionally have, there would be one moment which would gather up the past, and the creative opens up to the future. And in these moments, persons move from their obsessive socialized roles into realms of personal choice and liberation. Instead of isolated individual, there is convergence of persons' conscious movement through simultaneity of experience. So instead of having an alienation between the self and the socialized role, there is a coherence. There is an active going beyond oneself into a larger world, into a broader context. Now, since we're talking about Virginia Woolf, there is no way we won't talk about A Room of One's Own. In The Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf talks about women's autonomy in narrative. See, the relationship between Virginia Woolf and feminism and Virginia Woolf is a symbiotic one. On one hand, her feminism, it's not just explicitly about female politics, but also with gender identities and women's lives, their histories, their fictions. On the other hand, feminist criticism has also been very critical of her views, and at one point in history, specifically in the 1970s, her views were completely thrashed and dumped. But then they were picked back again in the 1980s by other feminist scholars, and from there they have only been there in the mainstream since the past 3-4 decades. So what exactly happened? See, Virginia Woolf's theoretical conceptualization of the room in A Room of One's Own was that a room is a space that is indistinguishable from, or rather merely occupied by, a woman. That would mean that as a space, that would render indeterminate the difference between fact and fiction. So the room would also function ideologically to represent female desire and subjectivity. Therefore, the room is both physically as well as metaphorically tied to the female form. Now, the criticism that emerged in 1970s was by two people. Remember, Woolf has asserted that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she's write fiction. Showalter says that Woolf is sinking away from the political domain to hide in a room, and therefore she's undercutting her authority as an effective feminist figure. On the other hand, we have Julie Robin Solomon, who says that her emphasis on the possession of the room undermines the feminist politics, because this is bringing up the capitalistic aspiration for private property, and it's compelling Woolf to succumb to the ideological pressures that neutralize her feminist opinion to patriarchal social institutions. But then in the 1980s, we had scholars like Toril Moy that asserted that, yes, Woolf does highlight how language is inherently unstable, so it's difficult to fully capture a woman's lived experience as a unified and complete consciousness, and that's why you need fragmented narratives. Similarly, Makiko Meno-Pinckney also argues that that experience cannot exist without being represented. And thus, Woolf relies on fiction rather than factual accounts to explore this idea. Interestingly, you will also see that sexuality is a major critical concern in Woolf's narrative, despite the fact that there are virtually no overtly described sexual encounters in her fiction. Chloe liked Olivia. Do not start, do not blush. Let us admit in the privacy of our own society that these things sometimes happen. Sometimes women do like women, writes Virginia Woolf in Room of Her Own. What would happen if we expand that imaginative landscape? What happens in fiction when Chloe likes Olivia? According to Woolf, an immense change would occur. It would open up new possibilities for women's imaginations and women's sexuality, and this would make them free from the limits imposed by masculine economy, because now two women are not waiting for men, but for each other. This creates an economy of difference, not lack, not sameness. Woolf describes her ability to imagine her characters' lives as creating caves. How I dig out beautiful caves behind my characters, I think that gives exactly what I want: humanity, humor, depth. The idea is that the caves shall connect and each comes to daylight at the present moment. Homoeroticism is thus allied with the particular type of creativity that marks Woolf's own imaginative approach to character. This attraction to women is a critique of compulsory sexuality, but at the same time, it also challenges the mainstream modernist construction of the creative inspiration as requiring male artist and female muse. But in Mrs. Dalloway, she also shows how female creativity runs the risk of madness, as indeed it did with Virginia Woolf herself. Now, so far we have only discussed about how Virginia Woolf deals with the inside. How does she deal with the war that was surrounding her at that point? Having survived the Great War herself, albeit as a civilian, Virginia Woolf shared common ground with her brother-in-law, who was the subaltern Philip Woolf. We'll see that Woolf herself had no experience of life and death circumstances that haunted ex-servicemen. When she visited Philip at Fishmonger's Hall in London, the recovery facility to which she had been sent, she recorded her observations, and some of which we understand today as symptoms of survival guilt. This included absent-mindedness and detachment. Woolf used her observations of returning soldiers to illuminate the reality, or in Mark Hussey's word, to give the lived experience. Our demigods in the trenches know perfectly well that in ordinary circumstances, they're very ordinary people. If you like this video, you can look at my other videos related to modernism and modernist writers, like this one.